Today's lesson is about fractions and mixed numbers. What I want you to do is pause the video, take a look at the objectives, the vocabulary, read the part about fractions, and look at the diagram down below so that you understand what is going to be coming up in the video. All right, the first thing we want to be able to do is write fractions in simplest form. Now, I use the phrase simplest form. You will also see the phrase lowest terms. So I'm going to go ahead and write that up here so you can see that as well. So we're going to see simplest forms or lowest terms. Okay, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to use what's called the fundamental principle of fractions. And generally speaking, when we have stuff using letters, it gets kind of confusing. So I'm going to explain what this is. It says if a over b is a fraction and c is a non-zero real number, then a times c over b times c is equal to a over b. In common language, basically what that is saying is if you have a fraction and the numerator and the denominator have a common factor, you can eliminate that common factor. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some examples and hopefully that'll make it easier to understand. The first one is 42 over 49. Now, if you think about 42 and 49, they have a common factor, and that's 7. So we can write 42 as 6 times 7, and we can write 49 as 7 times 7. Okay, so if you look at the fundamental principle of fractions, the second 7 in the numerator and the second 7 in the denominator are the same as c in the fundamental principle of fractions. So we can eliminate that 7 so that we're left with 6 over 7. So in simplest form or lowest terms, 42 over 49 is equal to 6 over 7. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Now you might notice right away that this one, the numerator is larger than the denominator, and that's okay. We'll have to deal with that at the very end though. So if we look at this one, it may not be obvious right away what the largest common factor is. If we think about 20, we know that 2 is a factor of 20, and that's also a factor of 88. 4 is a factor of 20, and since it's 88, they're both 8s, we know that 4 is a factor of 20 as well. And then 5 is another factor of 20, but that doesn't go into 88. 10 is a factor of 20, that doesn't go into 88. So we're going to use 4. So we're going to say that 88 is equal to 22 times 4, and 20 is equal to 5 times 4. Okay, so we can eliminate that common factor of 4. So we end up with 22 over 5. But 22 over 5 is an improper fraction. So what we want to do is write that as a mixed number. And the easiest way to write that as a mixed number is simply to divide 22 by 5. And if you need to use a calculator to do this, that's perfectly fine. However, you're going to get a decimal on a calculator, but we don't want to write it as a decimal. So I'm going to do it by hand over here. So 22 divided by 5. Well, 5 goes into 22, 4 times. So we put 4 times 5 is 20. And then 22 minus 20 is 2. And 5 does not go into 2. So I'm just going to leave that 2 there. That's my remainder. And so the mixed number that I want to write is 4. So I put the 4 as the whole number in the mixed number, and then the 2 is going to be the numerator in my fraction. So I have 4 2/5. Okay, so every now and then you're going to see little helpful hints on pages. So in this case, it says some fractions like 11 over 27 are already written in simplest form. That's because 11 and 27 don't have a common factor. So that's something that you're going to want to watch out for. All right, the next thing we need to be able to do is multiply and divide fractions. And when we're multiplying fractions, basically we're going to do what's called multiplying across. And we have to be really careful because there's another term that we use in math called cross multiply that is very similar, but it's a completely different process. Okay, so if we look at the example down below, 3/8 times 7/9, we simply just multiply across. So if we use what's in the blue box above, we just say 3 times 7 in the numerator, 8 times 9 in the denominator. Okay, and then we could go ahead and multiply here, but what I like to do is I like to look for common factors like we did before first. So I'm going to look at that and say, well, 3 and 7, they're just 3 and 7. So I'm going to rewrite those as they are. But then on the bottom, what I want to notice is the 9. I can write the 9 as 3 times 3, but the 8 really, I could rewrite it as 4 times 2, but it's not going to help me at all. So I'm just going to write 8 times 3 times 3. And from the previous page, when we simplify and write in simplest form, we can eliminate one of the 3's in the bottom and the 3 in the top. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate the 3 in the top and then just one of the 3's in the bottom. And now I can do my multiplication. So I have 7 over 24. Okay, so you could wait and do this simplification after you multiply across, but if you were to do that, in this case, you would have 21 over 72, and then you'd have to sit there and try and figure out what's a common factor between 21 and 72. So it's a little bit simpler to do it before you actually multiply. Okay, and the second one, same thing. So we're just going to multiply across 2 times 5. And in this case, I'm going to simplify, or I'm going to factor that 15 before I do the multiplication over here. So I'm going to write that 15. I know I can write it as 3 times 5, or I'm going to do 5 times 3 times 13. And then again, I can cancel that 5 because it's a common factor. And now I can multiply. So I have 2 over 39. And that is in simplest form because we have eliminated all the common factors, and there happen to only be 1 in this case. Okay, let's keep going, do a little division. So multiplication and division are very similar. They're basically exactly the same, except what we have to do is we have to take the second fraction when we're dividing, and we have to flip it over, and that's called finding the reciprocal. And so we're going to take the second fraction, we're going to flip it over, and we're going to change to multiplication. So if you look inside the blue box, you can see that's what's happening. So the second fraction of c over d becomes d over c, and the sign changed from division to multiplication. So we're going to go ahead and do that here. So we have 4 over 5, and I'm going to change it to multiplication. So times 16 over 5. And if we look at this one, we could rewrite the 16 as 4 times 4, but there isn't a 4 down in the bottom that we can factor out or cancel. We could write it as 2 times 8. Same thing though, there's no 2 or 8 in the denominator, so we can't do any canceling. So in this case, we can look at this and say, hey, I know this is already simplified, and I just need to multiply across. So 4 times 16 is 64. And 5 times 5 is 25. And then again, this is a improper fraction, so I want to write it as a mixed number. And so I'm going to divide 64 by 25. 25 goes into 64 2 times with 50. And then 64 minus 50 is 14. So my remainder is 14, so I'm going to end up with 2 and 14 25ths. Okay. Sometimes you're going to be given problems where you have a fraction and then one of the things is not a fraction. In this case, it's just the number 14. And you should remember that you can always make something into a fraction by putting it over 1. Okay, and since we're dividing, we're going to flip that fraction. So we have 7 over 10 times 1 over 14. Okay, so basically any whole number like 14, if you take the reciprocal of it, it becomes 1 over that number. So in this case, it's 1 over 14. And I can rewrite 14 as 2 times 7. So I'm going to have 7 over 10 times 1 over 2 times 7. And I want to do that so I can simplify, so I can cancel the 7 because it's a common factor. And we end up with 1 over 20. Okay. All of these problems, you can check your work on the calculator that I showed you how to use. So if you want to check your work on the calculator, you can feel free to do that. I wouldn't go to the calculator first. I would make sure that you can do it on paper and in your head before you go to the calculator. All right, the last thing that we need to be able to do is add and subtract fractions. And it says in the box, adding and subtracting fractions with a common denominator. Whoops, it says with the common denominator. I need to fix that. So if they already have a common denominator, all we have to do is add the numerators together, and you'll notice that the b stays the same. So we're just leaving the denominator the same. So in the first example, they have a common denominator, so we're just going to say 4 plus 5 over 7. 4 plus 5 is 9, so we have 9 over 7. And in this case, I do need to write this as a mixed number. So I'm not going to actually write out the division. I'm just going to look at it and say, well, I know that 7 goes into 9 once with 2 left over. So 1 and 2 sevenths. Okay. All right. And then if we're going to subtract with a common denominator, we simply just do subtraction instead of addition. So we have 8 minus 3 over 5. 8 minus 3 is 5. We have 5 over 5. And anytime we divide a number by itself, that is equal to 1. All right, last page here. So now we have two fractions that don't have the same denominator. So they don't have a common denominator. So what we need to do is find a common denominator. And in this case, we can look at these two and say, well, 5 doesn't go into 4, 4 doesn't go into 5. So I'm just going to use those two to multiply together to create a common denominator of 20. Okay, and so if I do that, I have to multiply the first fraction by 4 over 4 and the second fraction by 5 over 5. Okay, and I do 4 over 4 and 5 over 5 because that's equal to 1, and it's not changing the value of either fraction at all. All it's simply doing is changing the denominator. And if I change the denominator, I have to change the numerator as well. I have to do the exact same thing to both of them. Okay, so if I rewrite this, 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 5 is 20. That's my common denominator. And then in the second fraction, I have 5 times 1 is 5. And 4 times 5 is 20. Okay, and common denominator now, so all I have to do is add the two numerators. So 8 plus 5 is 13. So I have 13 20ths. And that is in lowest terms or simplest form, so I do not need to do anything else with that. All right, the last one, it involves subtraction. But with this one, it's a little bit different than the first one, because if I look at the 6, I know that 6 goes into 18. And if I want to turn that 6 into an 18, I need to multiply by 3. So what I'm going to do is only multiply the first fraction by 3 over 3. Okay, so I multiply by 3 over 3, so I have 15 over 18 minus 7 over 18. So now I have a common denominator. And 15 minus 7 is 8. And so I have 8 over 18. I know they're both even, so they have a common factor of 2. That means that I can write this as 4 times 2 and 9 times 2. Cancel the 2's. That looks like a 4 up there. I'll do a better job canceling it. So I end up with 4 over 9. All right, so next thing I want you to do is, after you've watched the video, is there's an assignment on Schoology. You need to download that assignment into Notability, and then do the assignment and save it as a PDF, and then submit it on Schoology when you are done.